and welcome to Earth, a not-so-serious look at the serious business of royal rumours, gossip, and gowns. I'm Camilla.
No, you're not. Oh my god. Was anybody fooled?
As you can probably tell, I've had absolutely the best time doing these Crown recap episodes.
But you are Tom and I am Maeve.
And welcome to the final of our royal recap episodes of The Crown Season 3.
I just can't believe it's all over now for another year, 2 years. But I loved it. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about episodes 9 and 10 of The Crown. If you haven't watched those episodes, stop right now. You got to go and watch them before you can listen to this. Unless you don't mind getting royally spoiled.
Well, I feel like we've been absolutely spoiled ourselves with this incredible episode, the imbroglio.
It starts off quite somberly. We've got the military plane carrying the remains of the Duke of Windsor back to England. And then we see the funeral for the Duke of Windsor. Absolutely loved Wallis Simpson in that incredible veil. Wallis is played by the actress Geraldine Chaplin, Charlie Chaplin's daughter, if you didn't know that. I didn't.
That's Hollywood royalty for you and me.
But I thought she was so good. Like, she was really good in the last episode, but she had some real standout scenes here. Like, I particularly loved her scene with Charles. Like, during the funeral, we had watched the Queen watching Charles's reaction and how affected he was by his uncle's death, that they had been close and that he saw himself in his uncle, something that they illustrated quite literally by having Charles's reflection in this framed portrait of the Duke of Windsor. And obviously the Queen is quite worried that he's going to end up like his disgraced uncle.
Yet another person shirking their duty, which the Queen absolutely hates. She's got no time for it. But Charles gets a little memento from the Duke via Wallis. It is a gold watch and a compass with the inscription, "No excuse for going in the wrong direction."
Very symbolic gift.
Yeah.
But that's not all she has to gift him. She also gives him some advice. She got 2 pieces of advice from Wallis. The first, never turn your back on true love. The second, watch out for your family.
They mean well, he says.
No, they don't.
Oh, shivers.
We saw that bit in the trailer, but it was no less effective than when we saw it in the actual episode itself, because you had the camera panning around to show Charles's whole family standing in basically a straight line on the opposite side of the room, so far away from him. It was very similar to the scene in episode 6 when he was being told when he was being told he'd have to go to Wales, and again really emphasizing his outsider status in the royal family. We then get kind of a confusing flashback to a young boy's mother giving him a piano, and the boy's name is Edward.
So confusing.
It's very unclear.
There's baby Edward, there's,
Duke of Windsor Edward.
And it could be either of them, but no, it's the new Prime Minister, Edward Heath, as a baby, as a small boy, playing a piano that they can't afford. This will come back later in a sort of fairly boring way.
It is a little bit shoehorned in though. But in the present, we learn that there is a miners' strike, and we see the Queen talking to Edward Heath, and she is surprisingly sympathetic to their demands. She says they're quite reasonable.
Yeah, she's positioned as the person who cares about the people in this meeting.
Yeah.
If you're trying to look for a reason for the crown or the monarchy, I suppose it's that someone who is just looking out for what's best for the British people.
And not motivated by politics.
Yeah.
But I liked this very obvious tactic to communicate that this new Prime Minister is bad news, because when Edward Heath, played by Michael Maloney with hilarious hair, arrives at the palace, he is ambushed by the corgis and he immediately bristles, and the Queen says they don't mean any harm, and he replies, all animals mean harm. They are a meal away from barbarism.
Which is essentially how he treats the great British public, Maeve.
Absolutely. They have another quite literal scene where he meets with representatives from the mining community, and they show him a piece of coal. They say, you've probably never seen one of these before. And he literally wipes his hands on a napkin in front of them.
Yeah, he spends ages scrubbing to get it off, and it's clear that he has never actually been to a mine in his life. He's only seen them on TV.
But he is very adamant that there is no class struggle.
Because he also came from a working class background and his parents had to make sacrifices.
I mean, I really hope that when Margaret Thatcher comes into it next season, they find a more compelling way of doing these kind of interactions, because I have to say Edward Heath just didn't do it for me. Again, like I was saying last episode, you really miss Jason Watkins as Harold Wilson. But Heath's solution to this miners' strike is not to negotiate, but to limit electricity and introduce the 3-day week.
It's literally cutting off your nose to spite your face, right? You see these power cuts are even in place in Buckingham Palace. The royals, I mean, it's great for the drama of this episode. Everything is suddenly candlelit, and you get all these shots of various royals walking in the miles and miles of corridors, pursued by footmen holding candles, and like not just a single candle, but like a candelabra. Yeah,
and it really adds to the atmosphere of certain scenes, which we'll get to in a moment. But because of these power cuts, the Queen is watching the news, and she's seeing these reports saying that there are now genuine fears for the stability of the country and the maintenance of law and order, and the general feeling is that the UK is in crisis, and the Queen herself is in a bit of an existential crisis, which we get more of in the next episode. Before we get to that, we've got
somebody else who's feeling a bit restless. It's Charles and Camilla. We get them in the boudoir, lying in bed together, pillow talk.
Bathed in golden light. All of these romantic scenes between them, like, it's so sympathetic to them. It really tells their story as a love story. We really can tell Charles is totally in love, and that they have a very deep connection in terms of how open he is and how candidly he speaks to her about his fears, about his role and about his family. Like, he is very frank with her about the funeral and talking about how he identifies with the Duke of Windsor. And particularly, as we've said before, so much of Charles's understanding of things is how it relates to him. And so he talks about his impression of his family looking at him, and he says that's what they must have looked like to him. Poor lost soul, he wasn't like them. He was brighter, wittier, more independent of thought, more true to himself, and so they united against him. And in that moment, as they looked at me in the same god-awful way, I realised I've just replaced him.
He's also the most modest of them all.
But he really feels like the whole world is against him, doesn't he?
And with Camilla by his side, he's more than a match, I think. But when the rest of the family realise that it's not just a bit of fun, they're not happy. You get some really horrible things about Camilla in this episode. You get Philip saying, "You don't love a girl like Camilla Shand. She's a bit of fun, and a welcome distraction from the rigours of the Navy."
Way harsh.
Yeah. Also, let Charles enjoy the rigours of the Navy if he wants to as well.
But then we hear Charles telling her on the phone, "I wasn't supposed to fall in love with you." He obviously doesn't listen to Anne's warning about making sure that she wasn't playing with him, that he was playing with her.
Well, this is definitely a love story as far as Charles is concerned. I do think they leave it slightly ambiguous as to what Camilla's feelings are. You do get the impression that she's very, very fond of Charles, but there is certainly this magnetic attraction back to Andrew.
Oh, yeah. Like, in real life, Charles only came into the picture for her when she was already 4 years into her on-off relationship with Andrew Parker Bowles. And she had a very clear idea of where it was going with him. And I think the kind of general thought is that the reason she got with Charles was to make Andrew jealous, because Andrew had allegedly been sleeping with other women, and that Camilla wasn't ready to commit to the kind of lifestyle that you would obviously have as the future queen consort. So while she enjoyed being with Charles, she didn't want to make that lifelong commitment. In real life, Camilla was the one who wasn't interested in marrying Charles, but they have gone to some lengths to embellish this in The Crown.
Yeah, finally we see why Charles Dance was cast in this. Because, you know,
full Tywin Lannister mode.
Disregard the coup. The coup was just a warm-up. He gets into some proper Game of Thrones scheming with the Queen Mum. This is such a great evil duo.
In real life, apparently, they didn't get along very well, but in terms of the show, they are colluding to bring an end to Camilla and Charles' relationship. We have Mountbatten being very blunt, saying the Shan girl was only meant to be an opportunity for an inexperienced boy to sow his wild oats.
Lovely image.
But we hear them conspiring to send Charles off for 8 months with the Navy overseas. And then Mountbatten says he'll entrust the Shand and the Parker Bowles families to the Queen Mother. It is so Game of Thrones-ish. I know you just said that, but even with the lighting, like all this candlelight everywhere, and it's so dark, and all the dramatic interiors and everything, it's just so...
Yeah, and you get, you know, the Queen Mother summoning the heads of the houses to a meeting. You know, it's like something out of another time.
And the use of the word imbroglio in that, like, unbelievably posh voice.
So yeah, she summons the parents and convinces them to get this marriage between Andrew and Camilla started.
This meeting shrouded in darkness. I thought this was like a very unusual addition. Like, the story of Charles and Camilla is like a good enough story on its own, and to bring it in, you kind of feel like they're sort of taking some of the blame or the responsibility for the end of this relationship out of Camilla's hands. Like, it's very sympathetic to her, and it sort of paints them as victims of their wicked, colluding families who are so old-fashioned and conservative. And then obviously they don't see what's coming.
Yeah, I would happily give up some of that sympathy towards Camilla for another scene with her, which gives a bit more complexity, like you're saying. Like, cut this scene with the parents, because, you know, other than the incredible lighting and setting of it, and the Queen Mother's great in it as well, you know, they don't add a huge amount, but I'm always going to want more young Camilla. When Charles is informed that he has been magically promoted to be an officer, having not got the qualifications, he knows that something is up. And not stupidly, he assumes that it's Mummy.
Especially because you literally have a portrait of the Queen staring down at him as his commanding officer tells him he is going to be posted abroad. So we see him rushing back to the palace in his convertible, no less.
Very cool.
To confront the Queen, and he accuses her of forcibly splitting them up. I just love scenes of these two together. I think they act so well together, Josh O'Connor and Olivia Colman. And we get really hard-hitting stuff from Charles when she asks why would she want to split them up. And he says, because she's not intact or from the right family, she has a mind of her own, or perhaps because it amuses everyone to take two people who are perfectly happy together and find a reason to break them up because there's a history of cruelty in this family. I won't stand for it. I won't be pushed aside like Uncle David and Aunt Margot.
There's so many allusions to his relationship with Diana that come in this episode. All this stuff about, you know, having someone who's intact and from the right family. There are major reasons in why the royal family was so pro the Diana-Charles match.
Yeah. And then as well, when you have the Queen expressing some doubts to her mother and saying, what if it's love? Shouldn't it be allowed to run its course? I was allowed to marry my choice. And the Queen mum saying, the system is too fragile, too precious to allow in unpredictable elements, dangerous elements. Like Diana, the most dangerous element that nobody predicted.
Yeah.
But I love that they decide to consult Anne about it. So they summon her. She rooms along in her car, singing along to Starman, David Bowie's song. And just this, oh, I just love this so much. And then she's humming it all the way through those candlelit corridors to the family room. And when she sits down, they're like, okay, chill out, Anne, don't get emotional, we just want to ask you some questions. And she's like so dry, so deadpan when they ask her what she thinks of Charles and Camilla getting married. She's like, fine, as long as he's prepared for there to always be 3 people in the marriage.
Such a loaded phrase. Like, you can't say that phrase without the implication being obvious.
Also loved when she revealed to them that she had become involved in this quandary because she herself had been sleeping with Andrew. And she said, I got what I wanted. A bit of fun. Sorry, mummy. That's what it was. So good.
Olivia Colman's shocked face is so good. It was like perfect parent, like, really angry about something, find something else out that they don't like, but there's no time to process it. It's like, what's going on?
But it was just such a good Anne scene, like so matter of fact. I really hope we get more of her next season. We see what kind of impact this has on the Queen then. She's so mean. She's like, stupid, naive Charles. Poor Charles. But the Queen doesn't want to be the one to tell him that Camilla's engaged, because she knows it will create rancor and resentment.
I mean, she must realise that there's nothing really to be lost at this point by telling him, but I guess
it just separates them further by her enlisting somebody else to do this job. Unlikely, but she may have offered him some comfort in that moment.
Yeah, some sympathy. She could have given like a softer version of that speech that we see her getting as a child about like duty and responsibility getting in the way. But she's not got entirely a heart of stone, because the other kind of subplot in this episode is the 25th wedding anniversary of Philip and Elizabeth. And it's great that at this point all their marital issues are totally resolved, so they can reflect on the strength of their union.
Yeah, the speech is...
It's the Queen's turn to write the speech, because Philip says that he did a very successful speech for their 10th wedding anniversary. She takes as her topic the things that contribute to a successful marriage, and she somewhat surprisingly comes up with family.
Like, the cheek of her. You have this really great juxtaposition of her talking about blood, kinship and trust, as we see variously Wallis Simpson all on her own, grieving, looking totally devastated. The Queen Mother smiling so smugly at the wedding of Camilla and Andrew Parker Bowles. Margaret and Tony looking so distant at the dinner table with literally a head separating them right down the middle. And then just heartbreaking Charles on his own, sobbing so far away from his home.
And you see him possibly most devastatingly in that white short-sleeved shirt and shorts, which looks so ill-fitting.
It's just such a sad moment. And then for her back in England to be saying, that pursuit of being a happy family is a tireless struggle, a battle worth fighting, but there is nothing in life to match it. Like, even she doesn't look convinced by that when she's saying it, although she does nail the thank you.
Yeah, she really nails that. But yeah, I mean, she's giving a speech in front of a room of people who are duty bound by the codes of the country to applaud when she finishes. So, I guess she doesn't even have to convince herself.
It's a pretty unflattering view of the family, though. Like, in general, I do think this show is great PR for the royals, and it really strengthens their reputation around the world. But he really makes them seem like a very unhappy family.
I mean, I think maybe part of the way it is good PR is it shows that there are very extreme versions of the kind of problems which happen in a lot of families. Maybe they just kind of have all the problems that might happen in a family in one.
I think it works to elicit your sympathy because it's not saying these are the most incredible people alive. It's saying these are people who are so unhappy and so isolated and trapped by their roles, and that what they do isn't easy and maybe isn't worth the privilege that being royal affords them. So by making you feel that sympathy, you warm to them, or you soften to them.
Well, speaking of feeling sympathy, the final episode, the finale of this season,
we've got the Queen in crisis mode. Like, Philip's not helping at all. When you see them talking and he's like, they're watching TV and he's like, can you remember a time when the country was in worse shape? Like, really rubbing it in and talking about how nobody has any confidence in the country's leaders, and the Queen's like keeps trying to change the subject and he just hammers it home every time. I did like, though, when she's saying to him that Margaret called and said she had something important to discuss, and he goes, she'd run out of tonic. That was good.
Very good line.
Like, you know, sometimes this season has felt like it could do with a bit more humour in it. So you really appreciate those moments, however few and far between they are.
And we got a familiar face coming back as well for this final episode. Hal Wilson was back with the minority government. And it's very sad because he reveals he has Alzheimer's. And I don't know, there's something about the way he plays that scene. I mean, I know it is, you know, later than the last time that we saw him, but he just does such a good job of showing a vulnerability. And, you know, you can see him being quite resolute and brave in talking about it, but also quite scared.
But you really believe, like, 12 years has passed since the first episode, and you can tell that he has aged, he's gone through a real transition.
His hair is so white.
But he seems like a very different man than the person who was so awkward in that first meeting with the Queen. And obviously there's that fondness between them, and she seems like she's very attached to him at this stage, and she's saying, I'll miss our sessions. And then he says, I always thought you were a lefty at heart, which is absolutely outrageous, and something that a lot of the people on the show have been saying, that the Queen is a lefty, or that they're left-wing monarchists. But she insists it's nothing to do with politics, it's just better company. But then you get the real treat when, as he's walking out, just at the last minute, she calls his name and instructs him to invite her and Prince Philip to dinner at number 10.
But that's an honour previously only extended to Churchill.
Thank you for that exposition, Peter Morgan.
Yeah.
But if she didn't have enough to worry about with another PM problem, Margaret is having a hard time.
So she's drinking even more than last time we saw her. She's still in bed in last night's dress. She's drinking what looks like a martini, and when the Queen asks where her kids are, she says, they wouldn't like me before midday.
We haven't even seen her kids this season.
Yeah.
But, you know, we were talking about how we missed her and that we weren't seeing very much of her. And now when we do get to see her, she's at rock bottom, basically. The room has been totally turned inside out. There's broken glass everywhere. And when the Queen asks what happened, Margaret says they had an exchange of views and that Tony has moved on to the next one.
And we see the next one, The Thing, as she's later referred to by Margaret. So this is a woman called Lucy Lindsay Hogg, who he goes on to marry. And she's been taken to Tony's special house that's just his. where Margaret has said she will never go because she hates it so much. And part of that, I think, is because he's wallpapered the bathroom with scandalous headlines about the royal family.
Yeah, he's got like tabloid newspaper stories stuck up on every available surface. He's
even got the one of the Duke of Windsor and the Nazis.
Yeah. And he explains it to Lucy by saying House of Windsor, House of Horrors more like, but that Margaret will never divorce him. And Margaret also explains why they're not going to divorce, not only because it's incompatible with her faith. She says, "This is just how we like it. War, brutal fights to the death is our mating dance. I speak for both of us when I say that we wouldn't have it any other way. Contentment is dull and Tony is anything but dull." It's like, this is a very dysfunctional relationship. This is a toxic relationship.
Margaret has probably one of the saddest birthday parties I've ever seen.
Oh my God.
So she's obviously been drinking a lot more than anybody else there. Tony hasn't turned up, which, I guess is probably a relief. But she asks the rest of the family to show whose side they're on by supporting her and stopping inviting Tony to anything, to forbid him from any of the royal properties, basically to cut him off from a lot of the stuff that he's been enjoying as a member of the royal family. And everyone just turns on her and completely sides with him. The Queen Mother, who, has been fully established as a monster at this point, she responds by praising his compassion, his wit and charm, his clever documentaries and photographs, and Philip joins in until Margaret calls him out on it, gets very upset, and leaves the room. And Philip calls after her, "Perhaps we're just sick to the back teeth of you."
It really illustrates what Wallis Simpson was saying in the last episode. It's like really horrible bullying by your family and they just let her go off on her own. It makes you wonder how they would treat another member of the family who's being bullied. At the same time as this, we're seeing Tony at his country house with Lucy on the sofa. You might almost say he's content.
They're wearing the woolliest socks in England.
But I think, like we were saying in an earlier episode, when in the early seasons we saw Margaret played by Vanessa Kirby and she was always so beautiful and glamorous and going to parties and seeming like the life of the party, and it was so fun. And now, like, the fun's really worn off.
Yeah, like, seeing her asleep in the back of this taxi arriving at her friend's house is anything but glamorous.
And having all her friends backing away so they don't embarrass her by waking her up. That's a really sad moment. But obviously they know that she's struggling and they're trying to set her up with all these hunks around the pool. But she's only got eyes for one guy, and it is Roddy Llewellyn, who I'm so excited to see. The stories of them together are so interesting, and they've got the very handsome Harry Treadaway to play him.
And he really rocks those Union Jack swimming trunks. You were very excited to see them.
One of my favourite royal stories ever, her buying him these infamous swim trunks. And in the show, we see them going into town to buy them. And on the way there, he's telling her about his landscape gardening and also his mobile disco company, Vibrations. Did you like the moment when they were shopping and they had a little saucy moment talking about his brief size?
Oh, I loved that. So Margaret asks his size and he says small, to which she responds, "I sincerely hope not." He means slim.
That's not the only one either, is it?
No, oh my god. So as he is a landscape gardener, Margaret comes up with the very witty, "I have a garden that needs doing. My garden is quite neglected." And this is as he's getting changed into the swimming trunks.
And she's like peeping Tom, watching him undress in the fitting room.
Hey, what did you call me?
We get to see how inseparable they become while staying at her friend's house, and that they're singing together at the piano. Obviously, we know Helena Bonham Carter was going to sing on this show. That they're holding hands, that we see him following her to bed.
It's very different. Sorry, the singing, it's very different from that scene we got right at the beginning of the season where she's kind of droning and everyone's kind of falling asleep and not looking at her, that when Tony is spying on her through a hole. But now she's full of pep.
And her friends are talking about her and they're like, oh, do we feel bad about her betraying Tony? And he says she's not betraying Tony, she's with Tony, just younger. Speaking of Tony, though, that scene where he goes to meet the Queen at the palace and he's got all this commemorative tat for the Silver Jubilee.
He's got a plate, a teapot, a mug, a tea towel.
That he's designed himself.
Well, she says at least that she's delighted with them, and he says, I'm always happy to help my family. He's such a little, I don't know, he comes across as a bit of a
smarmy bastard.
Like a leech almost.
And when she asks, are you? And says she doesn't want to lecture or pry, but I often think turning a blind eye is the best approach. Things tend to work themselves out in the end. Oh my god, stiff upper lip. Here we go.
Yeah.
And then we have him slut-shaming Margaret, talking disdainfully about how she's conducting herself with Roddy.
Yeah, this is the guy who's been off with God knows how many of these Lucy Lindsay hogs.
And Luke Lindsay hogs. But it doesn't make things any better that while Margaret and Roddy are in Mustique, they get papped with him applying suntan lotion to her while she's wearing a strapless swimsuit.
If only she'd worn one of the many, many caftans that she brought with her on this trip.
Oh my god, they're sensational. She actually did wear a strapless swimsuit. You can look up the pics if you want. But I was so glad to have a bit of personality and colour in the costumes again. I felt like it got quite stayed there for a while, but having her back so prominent, all of those printed caftans, they were incredible. Obviously a fan of Roddy's little denim shorts and his tank tops, right?
Yeah, and his headband.
Oh yeah, that was so good. But, he's not the brightest. The scene where they're talking and she kind of opens up to him and she says happiness is an elusive creature to her and that she's not complaining that it has arrived so late. And he's like, huh? It totally goes over her head. Goes over his head. But I wasn't so keen on the bit where they were dancing and she sees a creepy vision of Tony as Woman in Black on the rocking chair on the porch. But yeah, those pap pics didn't do her any favours, did they?
No, certainly not with the family once they read them. Oh my god. Philip saying, how could they be so stupid? And the Queen Mother saying, she's behaving like a whore.
That was so shocking.
Yeah.
I mean, we have heard that the royals do have very colourful language. Apparently Charles is a big fan of the C word.
Wow.
But
That's not Camilla.
No. I thought it was very interesting, the scene where Tony is reading it, and later when Lucy comes in to ask if he's happy that now they can have what they want and be together, he says, why would I be happy? You expect me to jump up and down with joy? She's my wife, the mother of my children. He's like, was there anything else? He's very cold. And again, it really adds texture to their relationship. They do have a love for each other, even though it's this very unhealthy relationship.
It's that kind of possessive love, I guess.
But it shows that abusive relationships aren't one-dimensional, that there's so much to it and so many layers of feelings and things to work through, and it's not as simple as, well, why don't you just split up?
Yeah, and there's not one template for how these things go as well.
But Margaret is also not very happy with paparazzi photos and those Lady and the Tramp headlines when they get back to the UK. There's a huge press pack waiting for them at the airport.
Couldn't be more different from her return from her triumphant trip to America, where she saved the country for a bit.
Now she's bringing shame to the family. Roddy tries to hold her hand and she pushes him away. that was sad. Like, she really seemed happy and, like, content, I guess, with Roddy, and then to be pushing him away. But at least we see her and Tony finally realizing that they can't work together, or her realizing at least, because when she gets back home, Tony's waiting for her, and when she asks him to leave, he says she really doesn't want him to, and she's like, I'm desperate like a patient wanting to cut out a cancer.
Next time we see Margaret after this intense scene is after she's tried to kill herself. She's taken an overdose of insomnia pills, and we see a very different Margaret.
But even before we see Margaret, you have the tension building because we see the other members of the family talking about her. And again, the Queen Mother just really laying into her, saying this was more of a cry for attention than a genuine suicide attempt, more a cri de coeur than a coup de grace. And she just, it seems very hard-hearted.
We see the Queen getting quite teary.
Yeah. And she really seems very shaken when she goes to see Margaret, and she asks, did you mean it? And Margaret says, I don't know, possibly. Which is really heart-rending moment. And she tells the Queen that her and Tony are gonna separate, and it'll be the first royal divorce since Henry VIII. But the good news is that announcement is likely to get buried under the announcement of a new Prime Minister, which will be the Queen's 7th.
Yeah. Again, that kind of playing into Peter Morgan's kind of running theme of why the Queen is kind of important, is that you get, I suppose, a constant with all this political change and all these leaders coming and going. Like Margaret says, the rest of us drop like flies, but she goes on and on.
I absolutely loved, one of my favourite scenes of the whole season was when they had that very tender moment where the Queen kisses Margaret's hand and says, for the record, I think there's many things you're good at, like being a sister. Of all the people everywhere, you are the closest and most important to me. If by doing this you wanted to let me know what life for even 1 minute would be like without you, you've succeeded. It would be unbearable. That moment totally made me cry. I thought Olivia Colman just did such a beautiful delivery of that line. And then when Margaret says, then we both must carry on, and smiles. And it's all the more powerful because we know that as they got older, they grew apart and that they lost the closeness that they had. And we saw some of that this season, but we know the gulf is gonna widen in the next few.
It did make me revisit Margaret's desire to share the royal duties in a slightly different light, because I think you can view them as not just about Margaret trying to get purpose for herself, but perhaps having an inkling of the Queen's feeling that she's missed out on this whole other life by having to take on the full responsibilities of being the Queen.
And she wants to share the load.
Yeah, and the Queen can't say yes to that, but maybe in this speech is revealing that she would really like to. But the Queen can't dwell on this for that long because she's got a absolutely massive party coming up.
It's the Silver Jubilee!
And we get a rare glimpse of the Queen's morning routine.
You loved this scene. Tom made us rewind and watch this scene a couple of times because he had to check one important detail. Did any of you catch it?
The Queen was on the toilet. The first time we saw this, I did a genuine double take. And I was like, Babe, is she on the toilet?
And we saw the Queen in the bath. One of many, many bath scenes this season. What was your favourite bath scene?
I think it was probably Charles Dance, because the dog was so good just sitting there next to him while he had the bath. A close second is Camilla.
Mine's got to be Margaret in the diamonds in the bubble bath.
But, Camilla's kind of sultry looking around the corner of the
door. That was a good one too. But As the Queen is preparing for this day, which newsreaders describe as a day as grueling as her coronation day in ceremonial terms, we get a cut back to the Queen visiting Margaret, and we see the Queen really doubting herself and feeling very insecure about her reign, as she says to Margaret, "Ask yourself, in the time I've been on the throne, what have I actually achieved?" And Margaret starts to say, "You've been calm, stable," and the Queen interrupts her and says, "Useless and unhelpful. This country was still great when I came to the throne, and now look, so much for the second Elizabethan age, which Winston talked about. All that's happened on my watch is the place has fallen apart," which is pretty damning.
I mean, it's so similar to the kind of stuff that Philip has been grappling with in terms of feeling disappointed with where you are in life, having felt like it would...
As all three of them have. You know, when we heard Margaret talking about how happiness has been elusive to her, they really all have to reckon with, like that priest said, how they would rate themselves on the scorecard of their lives at this middle-aged juncture.
Margaret's response is pretty insightful. She says, "It's only fallen apart if we say it has. That's the thing about the monarchy. We paper over the cracks. If what we do is loud and grand and confident enough, no one will notice that things have fallen apart. That's the point of us. Not us, of you. You cannot flinch, because if you show a single crack, we'll see it isn't a crack, but a chasm, and we'll all fall in. So you must hold it all together."
Is that the Crown's view of the Crown?
I think so. I mean, this point is delivered at such a pivotal, crucial end moment for the season. And I think it definitely echoes and reinforces what Olivia Colman said about the smoke and mirrors being so important. I mean, she was viewing it more actually from a personal point of view, that the smoke and mirrors help protect her family. What Margaret is saying is that it's the ceremony, it's giving people something to focus on, and it is, you know, someone who goes on and on whilst everyone else drops like flies.
I feel like, though, this is such an interesting time for this to come out. You know, we've seen in real life the monarchy being described as being in crisis in the last few months, with things like the constitutional crisis over Brexit, and David Cameron revealing that he had explicitly asked the Queen to intervene in the Scottish independence referendum, and that she did. And also, of course, you have the allegations against Prince Andrew of his sexual misconduct with girls allegedly trafficked by the paedophile Jeffrey Epstein. And then on top of all that, you've got the younger royals and the rumoured rift between Prince William and Harry, and as well all of the drama around Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, both in terms of the unrelenting media scrutiny of them in the tabloids and then their lawsuits as well. So you have so much going on that it doesn't seem like the monarchy is holding it all together. We can see the cracks, and the Queen herself is responsible for a lot of that, in terms of intervening in politics when she's supposed to be politically neutral, in terms of not intervening in support of Harry and Meghan, and then whatever she's doing to shield Prince Andrew by sticking him next to her in car rides to church at Balmoral, and allegedly quashing stories about him in the media. To have that coming out at this time, I think it really complicates my understanding of the show, and maybe not for people who don't watch the royals as closely as we do, but I don't think it is as simple as this speech makes it out to be.
No, I mean, this speech is perhaps trying to speak across the decades, but it's very much of its time. It applies to the royals perhaps at this point in history, but quite apart from anything else, there's so many of them now. It's difficult, I would imagine, to keep control to the same degree as the royal family was used to, but also, like you say, it's difficult to think what the Queen has done right in a while. It used to be, you know, at this time, it's the kind of don't do anything and people will be grateful for it. But she hasn't followed that rule. She's been a meddler.
But I really loved the final scene I thought it was a really rich ending to the season and really intriguing look at where we're going to go next. So it's the Queen in that exquisite pink hat and pink coat getting into a magnificent gold carriage, and she looks out and she sees Prince Philip smiling proudly at her. But as she looks through the rear window, we get a glimpse of a very unhappy Charles on his horse with the parade behind her. And then it fades out on this close-up of her face. And it's just like astonishing work from Olivia Colman. When it's this close-up, she looks very resolute, but you can also see her anxieties and her fears for the future and for Prince Charles. And that whole moment is just a really astounding finale, I think.
And it's so good to be inside the carriage. It feels so claustrophobic and sealed off, which plays into so many of the themes of the season. And then, to have Prince Charles hot on her heels, following on his horse. Now, obviously we know 50 years on, he's still waiting. But, you can see all those worries playing across Olivia Colman's face.
And the whole point of The Crown is to make us feel more intimate with the Queen. And it really does that. And I just thought it was a wonderful cap to the season. But what about your highs and lows? What's your low point from these 2 episodes, Tom?
My low point is the plot to split up Charles and Camilla. I thought it was a bit of unnecessary high intrigue. I think, like I said, I would have preferred a bit more about Camilla's role in it and her feelings on the situation, which I think they glossed over unnecessarily.
It does make me very curious as to how they're going to tell the Diana story. Like, this approach suggests that they may be surprisingly sympathetic to Charles and Camilla, and that they may offer a more complex, more nuanced portrayal of Diana and her role next season than what we typically get.
I mean, yeah, they're framing this as a love story between them and, Charles and Camilla at Endgame. So
and Diana's the interloper, yeah.
Yeah, which is very interesting and will probably be very controversial. So bring
Definitely.
that on. What about you? Low point.
Tom, I was a little bit disappointed with what was left out this season. Obviously, they covered 13 years. They're not going to fit everything in 10 episodes. But I was surprised that they didn't feature anything about the Troubles in Northern Ireland, because they started at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. They really kicked into high gear, and all that would have been going on at the time. And I feel like that would have really had a big part in why the Queen was feeling that existential crisis, and all of the narrative around the UK being in turmoil. So much of that you feel like would have been impacted by the bombings and the violence in Northern Ireland, and I was expecting more of that after seeing that quite carefully considered portrayal of the Welsh nationalists that they devoted so much time to in the 6th episode. And I'm particularly interested, given that, as we know, Mountbatten was killed by an IRA bomb in Sligo, and that's presumably going to be a big part next season. So maybe they'll get more into it in season 4, but I would have liked to see them laying the groundwork a little bit. High point?
Well, my high point is Roddy's swimming trunks. No one's ever pulled off the Union Jack with quite such aplomb.
I think it's going to be a big look next summer.
I really hope not. I don't want to see Union Jacks on anything.
Mine is Princess Anne singing Starman in the car. What a rock star. That was a badass moment. I loved Princess Anne all season, and I would have loved to see the beginning of her relationship with Mark Phillips more. They got married in the 70s, so they would have been married by the end of the season, and that wasn't included. Maybe they'll have a bit of it next season, but I really want more Anne. She was standout for me.
Well, it's really kind of you as well to offer to sing us out of this episode.
But I think now that we've come to the end of the season and the end of our recap episodes, looking back on the 10 episodes, what was your overall impression?
I really enjoyed it. The main performances were impeccable. I thought, Olivia Colman, great. Josh O'Connor, great. Camilla, Emerald Fennell. I think if I had to pick something that I will take away from this season, it would be the rehabilitation of Camilla. Because of all the reasons that we've discussed, it not being necessarily widely known that Camilla and Charles were a thing before Diana, and then also, just the fact that we get to see a young Camilla, because I think that our vision of Camilla is very much, post Diana.
And I don't think we can overstate how significant it is that they've cast such a beautiful, sexy woman as Camilla, but that she looks like Camilla. It's not like, the total Hollywood version of Camilla, that it reminds people why Charles was attracted to Camilla in the first place.
Oh, yes.
That she was fun and funny and...
made him feel funny and fun.
And confident, yeah. And that they were good for each other.
What about you? Overall impression?
I totally agree with you, Tom. I really enjoyed it. I felt like it seemed like a richer series to me. I felt like the stakes were a little bit lower than in the previous seasons, but I thought that was to its benefit. When you didn't have all the conflict in Philip and Elizabeth's marriage, when you didn't have the drama of Margaret's relationship with Townsend, all of that stuff removed, it really focused more on the interpersonal dynamics in the family. Like, my highlight would be any of the scenes with Olivia Colman and Josh O'Connor. Like, I was just totally enchanted by Josh O'Connor as Charles, and I'm very excited for everybody to be smitten with hot Charles.
Oh, yeah. I predict a rise in the sale of double-breasted blazers after
and
this.
Those, like, polo tops.
Oh, yeah. Got to get me one of those.
But thank you so much. If you've listened this far with us, we really appreciate it. We hope you enjoyed it. And if you're new to the podcast, we would love if you came back and listened to us talking about the real royals.
If you liked these episodes, then leave us a rating and a review wherever you get your podcasts, and tell a friend.
You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at AirheadsPod, and on Facebook at Airheads. We will be taking next week off, but we will be back in time to talk about Archie's Thanksgiving in America. Really hope we get some details on that.
I hope we get a costume.
I want to see my little pilgrim. Only if Meghan and Harry want to show him to me. But thanks again so much for listening, and have a great week. Bye.
Bye.